Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session titled From Bednets to Mindsets, the Case for Mental Health in Effective Altruism with Joy Bittner. I'm Colleen, and I'll be the MC for the session. Following Joy's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where she'll respond to your questions. You can submit the questions through the swap card, live discussion feature, and then after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. But now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the session. Originally from the US, Joy spent the past 15 years living and working in Latin America. Most recently, she is the founder of Vida Plena, a mental health organization that trains local community leaders in proven evidence-based strategies to treat people with depression. This method has been endorsed by the World Health Organization as their top recommendation for mental health care in low-income settings. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Joy.
All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're located. Just thank you so much for making this time to kind of come in and join us. I'm going to start off with a question. Take this as a nod from Happy Lives Institute, but if you could only pick one of these, which one would you pick? Would you pick wealth, health, or happiness? So it's a bit of a trick question. I even highlighted, but most of us realize pretty quickly that both wealth and health are what philosophers would call instrumental values, which are trying to get us to what we intrinsically value, something like happiness. So you're probably wondering, where am I even going with all this? The reason I'm planning this out is because in EA and then broadly in development economics, we have to have a way to be able to decide where do we want to put our money? What do we value most? And so traditionally, we've been using things, and hence Bednets, we use things like metrics like lives saved, money earned, increased income, or some sort of a health metric, often a DALY or a QALY, which is an attempt to quantify across different diseases, how much does someone's life improve or not, or how much problems does this disease cause them? Since it doesn't outright kill them, how do we compare something like malaria to parasites? And so these are types of metrics that we often use. However, I'm going to plant that because of this whole focus, it often causes us to miss things that we also might value, such as well-being, family relationships, personal agency. And so then going back to the idea, so it's what are we intrinsically aiming for? And a lot of people would put, we're actually just trying to contain this idea in well-being. And so there is a metric, an alternative to the traditionally used DALYs and QALYs, which are called well-bees. And it's basically when you just ask people to rate their own subjective happiness, their own subjective well-being. And the reason I bring this up altogether is because it often, when we focus too narrowly on health and as a physical health and too narrowly on income, it often causes us to miss other important areas. And that's what I'm going to be making the case for today, that why you, as a very thoughtful EA, should think about mental health as an important cause area. Then I'm going to make the case that we do have effective and cost-effective interventions, and then paint a little bit about what the future could look like in mental health. And so why does this all matter again? This is a chart that's showing kind of the investment in global development funding in low and middle income countries. As you can see, less than 1% of funding goes to mental health. This is from 2017. There has been an increase, but the numbers haven't changed all that much. This is also the same in the public health system. So I'm based in Quito, Ecuador, and Ecuador is a pretty typical situation in that less than 1% of our public health budget is spent on mental health. So this is 6 times less than rich countries. And the result is that only 8% compared to about 33% of people in rich countries are able to get the care that they need. So why should EAs care about mental health? First off, neglectedness. This is very much a problem. Also, I just want to kind of point out something that's often overlooked or often kind of conflated is kind of contrary to widely held perceptions from the 20th century. Depression and anxiety aren't just diseases of affluence. We often think it's just our modern society and modern pressures, but in reality, those in the lowest incomes in a community are the people who suffer from depression, anxiety, these common mental illnesses 3 times more often than those with high incomes. And even more notable is that 80% of suicides, according to the World Health Organization, happen in low and middle income countries. So mental health is definitely a problem in low income countries as well. However, on the flip side, sometimes I'll hear, well, if we could just improve poverty, we just improve people's incomes and then that'll go away. Well, if you live in a high income country, the US, UK, you know that's also not the case. You know that also there are very much mental health problems there as well. In fact, this might become somewhat as a surprise, but there was a Wellcome Trust study done in 2020, and they asked people around the world about their experiences with anxiety and depression, and Latin America came out the highest. We can go into a lot of different reasons about why that is. That's a little bit of a sidetrack for what the focus of this conversation. But what I do want to point out is that there was a study done by UNICEF, and they estimate that the cost of this untreated mental health illness is $30 billion annually. But so going in next step, why do we care about this as EAs? So depression has impacts. Has a lot of impacts on our lives in all different ways. It impacts our attention, it affects our memory, our ability to make decisions. And then also untreated depression is associated with a whole host of other issues. A lot of times we like to create these boxes. We have the mental health box and we have the physical health box. But I don't know about you, but I live in only one entire body. My brain is connected to my body is connected to my brain. It's all connected into one space. And so because of that, it probably should come as less as a surprise to us that untreated mental health conditions are associated with things like higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of heart disease, even higher rates of cancer. And of course, it spills over into all other areas of our life. There's higher rates of divorce, there's more child neglect, there's more problems at work, school settings. But really, all of these sort of like numbers, facts, and figures, they're like a nice way to try to quantify what we're talking about. But I'm sure that there's a number of people, you, yourself, or someone you care about has gone through a mental health illness. You know what I'm talking about. You know we're talking about much more than just being sad. Depression is marked by feelings of utter hopelessness. And on top of that, the terror that it'll never get better. It's that feeling of like not being able to get out of bed every day, not being able to do the things that you want, not enjoying the things you normally do, not being able to show up for the people you care about. And it's so much so that people with untreated depression are 20 times more likely to commit suicide. So really at the end of the day, as EAs, what do we care about? Our mandate is to treat suffering. And it's a bit of a bold position, but I feel that untreated mental illness is one of the greatest sources of suffering. However, the good news is we do have treatments that work. We have evidence-backed treatments that have been tested and proven and studied, and they are both cost-effective and scalable. And they're being used around the world. Specifically in Vida Plena, we are using an evidence-based treatment called interpersonal therapy, which is the top recommendation by the WHO, specifically for low-income settings. And it is highly evidence-based. Going back to 2006, they did an RCT, and they found that there was an absolute reduction in symptoms in 75% of participants as compared to the control group 6 months following the end of treatment. So this is not just a temporary adjustment, something that's lasting. This model of therapy is being used around the world. It's used extensively across sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, it's used by UN refugees, CARE International in Uganda, and the entire Ministry of Lebanon is using this in the Middle East. And then finally, I just want to call your attention to the Journal of American Psychiatry in the top bottom right. And I just want to read you their conclusion because I find it rather amazing. These are researchers. Researchers always tend, as we know, it's very much kind of like hedging, a little bit uncertainty there, a lot of like further studies needed. But this is their conclusion as they looked at this meta-analysis of interpersonal therapy. They concluded, there is no doubt that IBT effectively treats depression. IPT deserves its place in treatment guidelines as one of the most empirically validated treatments for depression. Just to repeat that again, there is no doubt. There's not many places where researchers make those sort of definitive statements that they made it here. So kind of where does Vida Plena come in all of this? Vida Plena, we started about a year ago, and we were trained by the Columbia University Global Mental Health Lab. And they were the ones who originally created the program that was then later adopted by the World Health Organization. This is our team here. And really what that means is we were certified in the process, and our focus is really treating depression here in Latin America. Just going to take a side note. We were part of the charity entrepreneurship program in the summer, and this is a bit of publicity for them. If this is something you're at all interested in, I highly recommend the program. They were exceptionally critical for us in terms of the support they gave, the training, and really much more just the wider network. Exceptional group of people who are really, truly committed to changing things in the health sphere. And something you're interested in, I'd love to talk to you a bit more about it. So kind of going forward. So what have our results been? We use what's called the PHQ-9, which is the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. And that is a person's self-rating of their depression. It goes through 9 questions asking people about things like their rates of hopelessness, their feelings, how they're sleeping, food, how they're eating. And then we do that at the beginning when somebody begins the session, begins treatment. At the end, then we do 3 and 6 month follow-ups. And we found that on average, there's a 7-point decrease in symptoms pre-post. What's significant about that is that at that 4 points is considered a clinically significant improvement. So that's we're really proud of these results. This is also in line with what's seen in the academic literature. As I pointed out, these are pre-post results. We don't have a control group at this point. We're hoping to set up an RCT for 2025. But still, this is in line with what is being shown in other literature. Also, we saw similar reduction in anxiety. We use this metric called the GAD-7, in which we saw most people move from moderate to mild anxiety. What does this actually mean in terms of real terms? What it means is that coming into the program, 70 people started with moderate to severe depression, and then 70% of people ended the 2 months of treatment with mild to no depression. And so we're really proud of this. And then just as sort of like a side metric, we also asked people about their ability to manage their life problems, and 85% of people responded that they felt they were significantly better to manage their problems after completing the program as before. So just to explain a little bit like how this works. The program is set up in such that there's 1 individual session, and then there are 8 group sessions, and then we do regular follow-ups. We work with, the groups are composed of about 8 people and a community facilitator. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Our meetings are either in person or online. Sometimes there's a little bit of a mix, which is something that was interesting. When we started out, we didn't expect to do any online meetings at all. But given our context, we're in Quito, which is an urban setting, and Latin America is rapidly developing. And so specifically with the pandemic, there was a lot of transition of people being interested in having more online. And so to meet that demand, we started doing that. Also, then the groups that meet in person, they meet in community centers, in churches, in the offices of partner organizations. And the reason that's important is because mental health here is, where it is available, it's still very highly stigmatized. And so people often, if they want to get mental health care, they have to go to a clinic. There's the psychologist there, the white lab coat. Whereas in our program, people are able to go to places in their local neighborhoods, places where they're already going, and they don't have to answer questions as to what they're doing there and what happened. So one of the things that I really want to point out is that this is a group intervention. And the reason I point that out is because that is what I believe is one of the most key aspects of this therapy and this intervention. Rather than having a one-on-one therapy, which is, of course, very powerful and very meaningful, but when that relationship ends, when you end the therapy, it's broadly, you don't continue to stay in contact with your therapist. In contrast, in a group setting, we do actually highly encourage the people to stay in touch. Every single group, we form a WhatsApp chat group. And then, so that's the way people are able to reach out, get support from one another in between sessions. And then at the end of the program, people continue to write each other. They continue to meet, just informally meet up for coffee, meet up for a meal. And that's really important. That's really important because often when somebody is going through depression, as we all know, one of the things that first happens is you withdraw. You no longer want to be you no longer want to have that contact, and you start to cut off your family relationships. And so in the group setting, it's a place for people to be able to come back together and be able to start to kind of have a space to be able to rebuild those connections and rebuild kind of those habits for being able to connect. Another part of the importance of being in group support is that people really support one another in what they're going through. And so just a favorite kind of story about that is during the pilot, I forgot to mention, we have 10 community facilitators who we trained. And so during the pilot, one of those, he's a exceptional guy, but he's a university student, meaning he's fairly young. And it just happened to be that his group, based on his neighborhood and the people who enrolled, because we try to keep people obviously as close as possible to the meeting location, happened to be that his whole group was composed of what we'd say in Spanish, like señoras, women in their 30s and above who were all having relationship marriage problems. And so initially we were kind of nervous about how that would play out. We were like, would they look at him like, what is this kid going to say? He doesn't have any life experience. How's he going to tell me how to fix my marriage? But Santi, he did an exceptional job, because really the point is for the facilitator to bring the group together, to guide the conversation. But really it was the women themselves that were able to support one another, help each other have new perspectives and better understand, just better support each other for what they're going through. It turned out to be one of the best groups. And so just kind of saying a little bit more about that, what it actually happens in these group sessions. It's a space for people to be able to, interpersonal therapy is unique in some ways in that it is very much focused on the here and now. So it's not a therapy, there's definitely places and spaces for this, but it's not a therapy where we'll be talking extensively about your childhood traumas or things from your past. It's very much about understanding what's happening in your life currently that's maintaining your depression, and what can you personally do to change that. The goal is to give people back their agency. The goal is to help people to feel that they have the possibility to make changes that will have positive impacts in their life. And so it's very much about understanding the interplay between your relationships and your depression symptoms, and then your depression symptoms on your relationships, and how does that all play out together. So kind of the next piece that just kind of talking about that is another huge point, is that we work with what are called community health workers, in a model that would be called in the literature task shifting. What that really means is we're training local people, local leaders, to be able to be the facilitators of these groups. They're certified in the model. And really what their role is, like I mentioned in that story about Santi, their role is to be able to bring people together and guide the conversations. And so it's not really something unlike what your very emotionally intelligent friend might do. They are there to kind of help ask sort of the follow-up questions. And so, and then to help you kind of think through new options. So a very common situation would be somebody perhaps going back, somebody's having relationship problems. And the first thing that we do often happens with someone's depression, you start to feel very closed down, and you don't feel like you have any options. And it feels like life is just kind of happening to you. And so one of the very common techniques that we'll use in interpersonal therapy is called decision analysis. And really what that is, again, it's just very practical. is like, let's list out all the possible options that could happen. And those options might be bad and they might be ridiculous. Or say you're having a problem with somebody at work. Okay, one of the options could be you show up at your work and you scream at that person and you lose it. Probably not a great option. And we do weigh the pros and cons then as part of the group. But the point is to really remind people you do always have options. A lot of the people that we're working with are coming from very marginalized contexts. We specifically target people who have no other access to mental health care. So that means we're working with a lot of refugees, a lot of people from very low-income neighborhoods. We also work in a residential treatment program for drug and alcohol. We work in a women's prison. We work with older adults. So they're people who are very much at the edges of society. Their options are limited, and we can recognize that. But the point is, there are always options. And training people to realize that helps people to bring back that sense of agency and that sense of like they can have control in their life. Secondly, one of the other goals of the therapy is that we don't want to just help people in that moment, but really it's about learning new skills to be able to take forward when you face a new problem. And so if you're already kind of have gotten this habit of being like, okay, I'm facing this situation, what are my options? Let's like list them out and then like start to weigh the pros and cons. It's a great kind of habit that anyone can do. It's very simple, it's very practical, but it's surprising like how often we don't actually do this. So then once we've kind of decided, okay, this is the solution, this is the best option of the range that we have. And again, that's done in the group setting. And so sometimes, especially with someone who's like starting out a lot of depression, they will have a hard time coming up with those ideas. But the group is there as well, the facilitator, to help throw out more ideas. Like, okay, so instead of just like going in and like shouting at that coworker who you hate, like what else could you do? You could talk to your supervisor. You could gossip about them. You could, so kind of helping generate those ideas. And then from there, we do, again, very practical, we'll do a role play. Very often we will then have the person act out with someone else in the group. Okay, how are we going to approach that situation? So you're going to go in and you're going to talk to your coworker and you actually just play it all out. Again, because that's being done in the group setting, there's an opportunity for people to give feedback. And so it'll be feedback like, wow, that seems really aggressive. I wouldn't have felt very good about that if I had heard that said that way. Or like, oh, like I didn't really understand what you were even getting at. And so it's a chance for people to practice saying the actual words out loud in that sort of safe setting. And then something interesting we'll often do is just do a role reversal. We had a really interesting, really kind of heartbreaking case in which there was a woman who about 16 years ago, she had an unplanned pregnancy. She went through with the pregnancy, had her daughter, and while she had always filled her bare requirements as a mom, making sure her daughter went to school, had food, basic things like that, she had really struggled to develop any sort of like emotional connection and bond. She was very cold. She was always very distant. She herself admitted this very directly. She just talked about how she really didn't feel any strong just affection towards her daughter. Her daughter was now 16 and was trying to reach out to her, trying to be able to build these connections. And so what we did in the group is we first had the mom play the mom with another group member who was also about the daughter's age, to try to kind of have the role-playing group member explain how she felt when she felt that rejection, what that was like for her. And then over the course of several weeks, slowly guided her, they did a flip and a reversal. And the mom played the daughter, and someone else in the group played herself, showing her what it felt like putting up that cold barrier. And it was a tremendous breakthrough moment. The woman told us, came back. She said for the first time she was able to go home and give her daughter a real hug and really able to express that express love and affection toward her. And so these are kind of like small things, but in the sum of a human life, they are tremendous breakthroughs. And so that's really the role of the local leader. The role of the community, the group facilitator, is to guide these conversations and to really just be able to implement it that way. Which is one of the reasons we chose interpersonal therapy over, say, cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy obviously is probably pretty well known. It's a more technical therapy. It requires higher skill. Because our group facilitators are not specialists, they don't have to be psychologists or have previous experience in the mental health field. It's really important that the therapy is something that's very easily learned and can then be applied. So kind of going off of that, one of the additional benefits of working in groups and also working with non-specialists is that this means we're a highly cost-effective therapy. We can treat one person for $120, and so that's all 9 sessions and plus the follow-up. Going back, just to break that down a little bit more, we can train one facilitator for under $200, and then they receive an annual salary of about $9,000, which for local Ecuadorian context is pretty decent. Just a little bit more about what that training actually looks like. We do 6 days of intensive training on what depression is, how to recognize it, and then going through all the different components of interpersonal therapy and the specific tools that we're using. We also, at the beginning, have a clinical psychologist who sits in on all of the group sessions that the community facilitator is leading, just to make sure they can intervene if anything comes up. And then from there, once the facilitator, we've decided that they are able to work independently, they still continue to have weekly sessions with that clinical psychologist to review all of their cases, to be able to talk through any sort of difficult situations that are coming up, and then to ensure that like there is follow-up care as needed. Anyway, so going back to the cost effectiveness, so $120 per person, and that comes out to be about $17 per well-be, which doesn't make a ton of sense by itself. So putting it into context, that means we've estimated in our predictive cost-effective analysis, because we're not running fully at scale yet, but we expect to be about 8 times more cost-effective than just giving cash out directly. So the organization Give Directly, for those who are familiar with it. So where are we going from here? So like I said, we started last year, we ran our pilot last fall, and then we're officially finishing up right now, year 1. In year 1, we've reached about 500 people so far, and we've just been operating in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. Our goal is to begin an expansion nationwide across the country, because we really want to be in the places where people have absolutely no access to care. I would be remiss to say if there was absolutely no mental health services here. It is possible to go to a private psychologist, but the cost of that is just completely unaffordable for the vast majority of the population. 78% of people in Ecuador either work informally or work for minimum wage. And so the cost of private therapy is completely unaffordable. So our goal is to be able to expand across the country. And then secondly, we want to be able to reach about 2,000 people. Our annual budget, just for context, is $350,000 for this coming year. And we want to be able to train an additional 20 community facilitators. And then finally, continuing to develop research partnerships to be able to help improve the quality of therapy. But I want to zoom out even further, just going beyond that, kind of thinking about like how can we scale this? So if one facilitator, we're operating at working full time, they can treat about 400 people annually. And our goal is to be able to train 25 facilitators over the next 25 facilities a year over the next 5 years. If we do that, that would mean we could actually treat 50,000 people annually. So just putting that in context of where we're at, the Pan American Health Organization estimates that any given time, about 5% of the population in Latin America is living with depression. So that comes out to be about 33 million people right now, in this moment. But those numbers were also pre-pandemic, so probably a bit higher now, but we'll stick with that conservative number, about 33 million people. And so for that cost per person, with a budget of $250 million annually, over the course of 10 years, we could actually reach every single person in Latin America who is suffering from depression. So obviously 250 million annually is a very high budget. And I'm not saying directly that Vida Plena should be the implementers of that. But if you go back, remembering that number where I mentioned UNICEF saying $30 billion is lost annually to untreated depression, there's a huge counterfactual opportunity here. So really what our end goal is to begin to work with the local governments. And if you remember, it's 1% of the public health budget that's being spent on mental health. if we were able to tip the scales, and that is really our goal, is like to demonstrate that this is something that works, and then convince national governments to increase their investment in mental health, we absolutely could reach that goal. And so that's our mission. Our mission here is to build strong mental health in Latin America. We believe that all people, regardless of their economic circumstances, their geographic location, they should have the mental, emotional, and spiritual tools needed for a flourishing life. And that's in our name. Vida Plena in Spanish means a flourishing life. So if this is something that you're interested in, we are looking for help. Very specifically, we are looking for someone who'd want to be able to serve as a data science advisor. One of our foundation principles is evidence-based, and that comes down to the type of therapy that we selected, but then also how we are working with considering our therapy going forward. We want to continually be making improvements, but we want those to be made on the basis of evidence. We're looking to use behavioral science insights and be able to applying them through a series of A/B testing to better understand how can we continue to improve our services. So with that, we're also looking for research partnerships with universities, and it would be great. We're also looking for someone who might be interested in serving as an academic advisor, someone who'd be able to help us to think through how to better manage some of those relationships, how to work with academic partnerships. Also looking to for someone who would be interested in doing content writing. We're experimenting a bit more with outreach through social media, through Google Ads. And so we'd love to be able to develop someone who wants to write around different mental health topics, specifically mental health topics related to university students, because we really want to be able to expand our program there. So if that sounds interesting, and then we translate into Spanish, it's a way to be able to kind of develop more information for people here about how they can treat their mental health. And then, of course, finally, financial support. Like I mentioned, for $120, we are able to do full treatment for a person. And so that means able to really not just transform that person, but their entire context, because mental illness doesn't just stay with one person, it affects everybody around them. And so that is something that would be possible. So that's kind of like just a quick overview of what we're doing, and look forward to being able to share kind of a bit more. But if it is possible, I would love to be able to play a video. Shows a bit more. Sorry. Are you able to hear the sound? Can I get a heads up, Colleen, perhaps, if you're hearing the sound on the video? Okay, probably won't make sense. Then we'll just leave that as another thing. I'll forward it to the group also. So we'll just kind of end there, and then go ahead and move into, I'll drop the link of the video into, I'll share it later on through the apps, through Swapcard. So so I'll just kind of end it there. And then if anyone has questions, love to be able to kind of chat with them more.
Great. Thanks for such an interesting and engaging presentation, Joy. A lot of people have enjoyed it. They've posted questions in the chat, so I'm just going to get straight to it and ask the most upvoted question first. In your test, so Joseph asked, in your test region, was there one or two particular mental health ailments which have disproportionate negative impacts on quality of life in that region? Is there one area of mental health which is more effective to specialize and focus on than others?
That's a great question. So specifically, we focus on treating what are considered like the most common mental health illnesses, depression and anxiety. Because we're working with community facilitators, we don't treat more severe mental health disorders, say schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. We only treat depression and anxiety. First off, they're the most common disorders, and also they have like the best outcomes in these settings. We do allow people who have comorbid disorders to join the groups if they're under other types of treatment. So it becomes like a nice complementary piece. Something else that also comes up quite frequently is what levels of depression do we allow in the groups? And so we do that initial screening. We the PHQ-9 that I mentioned. And what we're looking for are people who have moderate depression and above. There's no top out on the top. And so initially, it was a whole lesson learned section, but initially we felt that my initial idea would be that we would screen out people who have very severe suicidal ideation and then refer them to other services. The problem with that was the whole reason we exist is there's not great other services to refer people to. And it just felt ethically, saying somebody, this is a group, this is a place for support. Sorry, you're too bad. We can't help you. So we did end up including everybody, even people who do have higher suicidal ideation in the groups. And we've worked really carefully with Columbia to develop a safety plan. We go through a very careful action plan with each person. We are constantly checking for suicidal ideation. And then we still do work hard to connect people who need psychiatric care to the services. And so we work with other local partners to be able to do that.
Great. Yep. Makes sense. Thank you for that. AJ asked, given the tendency of people suffering from depression to not want to be part of groups or form relationships, what have you learned about encouraging engagement and overcoming stigma that can be applied when expanding the program?
Yeah, would have to say one of the unexpected and very few upsides to the pandemic was that it has opened up conversations around mental health, even here in Ecuador. So when we were doing the pilot, I read a Y Combinator. We were trying to figure out how to enroll people, and I read a Y Combinator article that talked about do things that don't scale. So I was like, well, I'm going to put this in practice. And so that specifically meant I went to across Latin America. They find these open air markets, fruit and vegetable markets. And I literally went, I forgot to mention, my co-founder is Anita Caslin, who is an Ecuadorian clinical psychologist. And so she's really this person who's in charge of making sure that the therapy is the best. But anyway, so we went and we handed out flyers in the market. And I started out with this kind of little discourse in which I thought it would be hard to explain to people, hey, this is what depression was, or not even explain. It was are you feeling kind of have a hard time going through difficulties? And people were like, oh, you mean depression? And I was like, oh yes, depression. Okay, you already know what that term is. And so yeah, people have already sort of developed sort of the vernacular and some of the understanding of the need for that. Of course, I'm not going to pretend it's easy. There's this sense of yes, this is a big problem, but for them. And then it would often be oh yes, the lady over there, she needs help, or oh, my neighbor. It's a little bit harder, of course, when it becomes I personally need help. But so that kind of it is a constant, it is a challenge. And so we do a lot of outreach. We do a lot of community outreach, community fairs, and then working with a lot of local partners, giving presentations about mental health. And it's a lot of helping people out self-identify, going through depression symptoms and talking about this is what it actually feels like, and this is what you can do about it.
Great. Jason asks a sort of good follow-up question to that. Is there anything that's proven particularly helpful in making sure groups stay in touch and continue to support each other after the end of the program?
Yeah, that's something we're still working on. That is really, we're kind of, to be really frank, we're in year one, phase one. It's absolutely my goal that the groups can, and at least some of the groups, transform into self-sustaining support groups, and we develop that leadership within the group itself, and then they can start to introduce new members. We kind of almost like an AA sort of model. We haven't gotten there yet, to be direct. That's kind of the next phase of where we want to be. It seems to be what brings people together more. I would say though, just kind of anecdotally, it depends a little bit if there's happens to be someone in the group who's kind of taking that step. Of course, the in-person groups do a little bit better than online groups in terms of that. Not 100%, but there's a little bit less of a barrier. I think it comes down to setting up the technology. But then sometimes the ongoing groups will organize themselves and meet up for coffee in person. Things like that do happen.
Great. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to follow along and see if this kind of thing happens in the future. Lolita asks, what strategies can be employed to address resistance or skepticism within the community itself regarding discussions about certain mental health disorders, especially where stigma is still very where stigma very highly influences society?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've been trying to do is people who have gone through the program are really just the best advocates. So we've been encouraging them to share their stories. We've been giving them both obviously within their own individual context, but then also we've been making an effort to people who are willing to share their stories publicly. So we were on national news, and we had one of our participants telling her story there. We're in a couple of local news stations. We were in a national newspaper. And so really just trying to get providing people those public forums to be able to share what their experience has been and why this is important.
Great. This is a question that maybe you can answer from the literature, given that you're only a year into your program. So Olivia asks, do you know if the benefits of therapy in terms of lowering depression scores continue to persist 1, 2, 3, or more years after the group therapy ends?
Yeah, there are some studies looking at that. Not a ton, but there is kind of some evidence that that is the case. And that's something that we want to look at further too. I would consider this this program a failure. If I would consider it a failure if we checked in with people and they had regressed just back to the same levels. That said, as I mentioned, the people that we're working with, we are specifically targeting people at the base of that proverbial pyramid. So that means people are facing very difficult life circumstances. We work with a lot of people who are refugees in our context. That means people who are coming from Colombia and Venezuela. And people who are coming from Colombia are fleeing armed conflict. And they're often the cartels, and often they're being pursued even when they come into Ecuador. And so there's a sense of it's how do we help people get connected with other services? Because therapy, mental health isn't a panacea for all of life problems. And I don't want to pretend it is. If we're working with a refugee who is facing housing problems, they don't have a work visa, they don't have a good job to be able to support their kids, going to therapy isn't going to fix all of those problems. However, on the other hand, if somebody's depressed and they're not able to function and they're not able to get out of bed, no one's going to show up at your door and give you a job. No one's going to give you a visa and help you go. You have to go through all of the bureaucratic hurdles. You have to be able to have the internal emotional skills to be able to push through those very difficult circumstances. And so what we really try to do is always partner with other organizations who are offering some of those additional wraparound services. They're helping with employment, they're helping with legal services. So that way we are an additional component to be able to supercharge whatever they're doing. We have a really interesting program that's running right now. There is a USAID funded program to be able to train vulnerable women as entrepreneurs. And when they were designing that program, it's the women themselves during the focus groups were saying, yes, but we want the hard skills, of course, like budgeting and marketing, but we really also need well-being support. And so that's how we got brought in. They asked us basically we run our groups with the women in that program. And we just did the first cohort of that, but they had a session in which they had some of the participants of that program meet with the USAID head of mission just to talk about it. And I wasn't in the room, but they told me after the fact that one of the women said that was her favorite. The well-being groups, our groups, were her favorite part of that whole program. And so what that says is people really do need that sense of caring for people holistically, not just thinking about these are their basic practical needs, but really positioning people in such a way that they're able to take advantage of other services just means we supercharge whatever other development goals we have. And there is tremendous research that talks about how adding mental health support to, say, tuberculosis, HIV treatments makes a huge difference.
Great. Time for a couple more questions still. One from Steph. I think this is a great question. Do you know where the biggest talent gaps are in the global mental health space? So if you were to advise someone who is early in their career on where they can make the most impact in this cause area, where should they focus their efforts? Would you advise them to start a charity, fundraise, go into policy research, or something else? And what is most needed at the moment and in the future? A lot of questions there.
Yeah.
The general direction is.
I think whenever giving career advice, I think first piece is always to consider is like, what do you actually enjoy? Because there's the highest impact thing in terms of a career is not just like statistically like, oh, I can reach this number of people. It's like, what do you personally like? You won't, if you don't enjoy what you're doing, you're not going to be effective. And so if you're the type of person who really likes a lot of human, like a lot of contact, you like doing direct service work, you're maybe not going to be the most effective program administrator or the most effective researcher, perhaps, because if you don't like doing that sort of like quantitative side. So I should like lean into your personal skills is like the first baseline thing. Secondly, though, but then kind of like answering that question more broadly, I think what is needed is we have a decent sense of what works. And so of course, like we continue to improve and continue to modify, there's always more to be done. But I would say rather than more research, I think what we really do need is the ability to reach more people quickly and to be able to spread the programs and these types of effective programs that do work. And so what that is like that is a lot of funding to be put into that, and hence the model that is being used by Vida Plena. There's also organizations such as Sangath out of Goa, India, who are really trumping this model in which community members are trained. Empower program out of Harvard is really, it's how do we train more people so that we could have non-specialists being able to provide care. And I think that's a key part. What I think is more needed, and there's a definite gap, is how do we get more preventative services? So rather treating people once they already are struggling, how do we help people and prevent that? And I think if I was thinking about my career, how do we jump into that preventative side and really expanding those types of efforts?
Great. And I'm sure, if people have more specific, sort of context specific to them questions about careers or anything else, Joy is available for office hours afterwards. I had one question myself, sort of following on from that, but how did you end up where you are? So, this is a great opportunity for people to realize that, not everyone who starts a higher impact organization had the idea to do so, a very long time ago. Sometimes these things come about or the opportunity sort of presents itself. But can you talk a little bit about the path that you've trodden to get to where you are?
Yeah. So I guess as a bit of a background, yeah, I would describe myself as starting out my career as one of the least effective altruists. I specifically started working in Latin America, running kind of these they're voluntourism tours in which you have high income students from universities from the U.S. and U.K. and we came and we mixed cement to build schools and houses because there is a fair lack of manual labor in countries, and so that's why we had to import students to this. And so it was kind of like the least effective altruism. It was very altruistic. People who came had the best of intentions. Even running the program, we had the best of intentions. It was definitely not effective. But that said, I think you can start from a place of good intentions, and then, but through like more critical thinking, kind of analysis and life experience, start to think like, okay, what else could happen? And I think that was my case. It was like, well, we did that. I did that for 2 years, slightly embarrassingly. But it was kind of like this overall sense of like, wow, this is not quite working. And then, but what I did like doing was I loved working in social programming, and kind of summarizing it all, came originally to Ecuador to run a fair trade company, and we were working with women artisans who made handmade jewelry. And that program was effective in the sense that for those 20 women, the program, it really did change their lives. We were able to pay them a living wage. It made them support their families, but it was hard to be able to expand and have further impact. And so that was kind of where I started thinking about it. It was like, what existing programs already exist? And I would encourage people to do this. If you're thinking about your career, is like, what really good programs already exist and how can you bring them in? And that's what we did with Vida Plena. Group interpersonal therapy is being applied extensively across Africa, Middle East, but we're the first ones doing it here in Latin America. And I would say replicate something that works.
Lovely. I'm going to be the MC that ends us bang on time. So I'd like to thank you very, very much for your presentation and for your great work. And I'd like to thank everyone who contributed with interesting questions. I thought this was a great session. Thanks again. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate just joining in and just for your enthusiasm on this topic and spending your weekend here. Looking forward to seeing everyone over in office hours, those who have further questions.
Take care, everyone.